Hello and welcome to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast, where we talk about leading remote teams, online collaboration, and working in distributed organizations. This podcast is brought to you by Virtual Not Distant, where we help managers and teams transition to an office-optional approach. Find out everything we do over at virtualnotdistant.com and check out our show notes and pictures of our lovely guests over on the podcast page. It's great to have you here, listeners. Let's get on with the show. Hello and welcome to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast. In today's episode, I'm talking to Robert Glazer about how to nurture the culture you want to see in a virtual team or indeed, in his case, in a whole organization. And Robert is the founder and CEO of Acceleration Partners and also of a few books. And before all that, a quick introduction in case we haven't met before. My name is Pilar Orti. Good to meet you. And I'm the director of Virtual Not Distant. And if we have met before, welcome back. It's a real treat to be allowed inside your ears. And regular listeners, you might have noticed that I didn't introduce this episode with a number because at the time of recording this intro, I'm releasing a set of bonus episodes around the findings of 3 different surveys looking at the world of work in September, October 2020. And I'm not sure in what order they're going to end up, so I thought we'd leave this episode without a number. Do look out for those episodes in your podcast app, or you can also go to virtualnotdistant.com and look for our podcast page under resources. And while you're there, remember you can sign up to our monthly newsletter with reading and writing recommendations. And that is all I'm going to say today. I will now leave you with my conversation with Bob Glaser, and then I'll be back to say goodbye. Well, I'm really happy to welcome Robert Glazer back to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast. And Robert is the founder and CEO of global partner marketing agency Acceleration Partners. And of course, he's also the author of a few books, including the latest Friday Forward and How to Make Virtual Teams Work. And podcast listeners, he is the host of the Elevate podcast. So make sure to check that out as well. Welcome, Bob.
Thanks, Pilar. Thank you for having me back.
I'm calling you Bob. Is that okay?
That is fine. My name has a lot of options. It's always been one of the struggles.
So you were on the show back a couple of years ago, episode 179, talking about values-driven culture. So I think it's fit that you come back and talk a bit more about
2 years ago was a very, very different world than today. Yeah.
Yes. Now, so I'll add. Okay, let's start in a different way then, because your company is a virtual company, isn't it? Has been almost from the beginning. Is that right? Yep. And how have you seen it change, or have you changed the way in which you all work during the pandemic?
Yeah, so you would think that we have a big advantage, having already figured out all of this stuff, and that was true in one respect. I think we also have a lot of people who value flexibility. A lot of those tend to be parents of young kids, and that's probably the I'd say most burdened demographic right now. So I think that it's required actually a lot more communication, checking in with people, making sure they are kind of handling everything okay. I mean, in talking to a bunch of other CEOs, and I'm going to say group I'm in, it's just the discussion of sort of the mental health of employees and the general fatigue and malaise that is going on just comes up every time. So we're not immune to that. And I think particularly in client services, you got clients that are stressed, and when clients are stressed, they tend to be tougher on teams. So, trying to just check in and make sure we understand where everyone is and how we can help them.
Yeah. The context, of course, of everyone else does impact us. And also, I think, of course, remote workers also had to change how they worked because it was not what they were used to.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and look, it's challenging a lot of preconceived notions. It's been fun for me to. I usually felt like I had to hide it 5 years ago that we were sort of a pariah, and now a lot of people who just made these it would never work or can't work or people won't productive, and then seeing. I'm not saying that that's what they want to do or it's right for their organization, but it certainly disproved a lot of theories.
Yeah, you're right that it's really legitimized. Those who do want to work like this have shown that it's okay to work,
Yeah.
and like you say, it's not for everyone. But hey, we're also proper.
I just got off an interview. Actually, I'm doing an updated full length version of the How to Make Virtual Teams Work, and I was interviewing the CEO of a large multi conglomerate company, and we asked him what was one of the biggest things that came out of it or surprised them, and he said it just sort of democratized the organization and put everyone on an equal footing. The people that had been working home for years and felt like sort of marginalized and they had to kind of overprove themselves just suddenly felt like liberated. And, the people that were in small offices were on the same thing as big offices. And that was just an interesting word, how it sort of democratized the organization.
Yeah. So very interesting already. And on the topic of culture, that what I'm hearing is that actually companies' cultures have changed during this time, even though they might not have even named it like that. Because I'm hearing a lot about how people are worried about how to maintain culture, how to sustain culture, and actually what's acceptable has changed already. So I just wonder whether companies are realizing that the effect it's actually having on their culture.
Yeah, and it's tricky because I actually I always say that like half of my book was actually about the cultural foundation that you need to build a remote organization, because I think you can do tactics and things like that, but I think people overlook the cultural aspects if you're going to do this permanently. And I think there are a lot of changes right now. I think they're temporary things, and I think organizations are going to have to make some decisions. One of my fears is that people will default as to hybrid as sort of the absence of a decision. And I don't think that's going to work very well. I think companies are going to need to be honest about what they want. Like either they want everyone back in the office and half the people don't want to be back in the office, or they want to come back to the office and the company wants to go remote. I think they're going to actually have to do some examination of who they are, what are their values, what's foundation, and understand that they're going to have, once they put that flag in the ground, a large group of people may decide to move on. But I think that's better than trying to be everything to everyone and not having a great strategy for that.
That's a great point. So let's go into what you talk about in the book, How to Make Virtual Teams Work, about how the mighty five principles in organizations which make up culture, because I think that's a really good reminder. So if we're going to go back to visiting that. So can you talk us through them? I can throw them at you,
Sure.
or you can start from the top with vision or with whichever one.
Yeah, and I'll just say that I always say that I don't think a great culture is an absolute. I think a great culture is a company that what it thinks, what it says, and what it does are aligned, right? Yeah. And so that's where these five come into play. So there's vision. The company has a clear vision of where it's going, what it wants to be, and communicates that. It has goals and targets, which are how you bring that vision to life. We want to be the largest pharmaceutical company in the world. Well, okay, and then what are the goals and targets that allow you to do that, and by when? So that's what everyone's working towards. And then in the middle of that is values. And I do them in that order because I think you try to move from your vision to your goals and targets while being true to your values. Sometimes it's easy to hit a goal and a target by violating your value, but that's not what an organization, like you should get there in service of your values. And then the modifiers are clarity and consistency. So what people want from a culture is they want a clear vision, clear values, clear goals. They want consistent vision, consistent value, consistent goals. And those are just the qualities I have seen in any high-performing culture or organization.
Mm-hmm. And how do we approach this, and how do we embed some of this in the organization? For example, the values is always interesting.
Yeah.
Yes, how do we use the values to help define the culture, as in how things are being done in an organization?
Depends on the size of the organization. It's either the founder, probably if it's a company of 100 or 200 or less, where they're still pretty founder CEO, where they're still really the DNA, or a larger organization. It's sort of peeling back and being honest about who are we and what do we want? I think there's a lot of people out there that just believe one thing and say the other thing. Remember my definition of think, say, and do align. Like it's just so easy when you do that. So if you're a super competitive athlete and you're trying to put a teamwork oriented, group bonus like vibe out in the world, you're going to attract the wrong people to your organization. It'd be better to own that. Like, so I would expect that kind of organization in the virtual world would have lots of dashboards and scoreboards that people are updating, right? And who's number one, who's number two, and like that's how they're staying connected. Versus a culture that is more around team and group would have more group meetings and team interaction. Like it would manifest itself in a different way. So it's still the same problem for most organizations. A good culture is not these like 10 words that everyone puts on the like integrity and trust. Like those are just pay for play. It's something that is differentiated. Here is why we are different and why you would want to work here. I sort of equate it to like the decision to go to a college or university, right? There's a lot of great colleges and universities, but they all have fundamentally different value propositions, like a small liberal arts school, a large rah-rah athletic oriented school. Like they're out there selling very different value propositions rather than everyone saying the same thing.
Yeah, that's really important to remember that a culture it's part of who we are, and who we are it's different to the person next to us, to the organization next to us.
Right.
So going back to your point about sometimes the culture starts with the founder, I wanted to pick up on that from you, because something that really struck me when I was reading. Well, when I've been subscribed to Friday Forward anyway for a while. It's a collection of stories, thoughts, bits of inspiration that started as something within your company. So I think that's a really interesting story. So can I take you back just to give us a sense of the makeup of your company? We know it's virtual, and a little bit about the journey of how it grew, so that then we can join the story of Friday Forward.
I can probably answer those tied together. So it started after I went to a pretty intensive leadership program where there was a focus on improving your morning routine. So it's taking some time to think, to read, and to write. And one of the things that was suggested was that when you read something in the morning, it would be sort of positive or kind of, inspirational. Some of the stuff that we were given just didn't do it for me. It was a little too rainbow and unicorny. So I actually decided I would kind of combine those activities and start writing a note to my team at the time, which was about 40 distributed people. I started writing this Friday inspiration note, it was called at the time. It wasn't about anything specific related to our work. I would take one of these topics, I'd dive into it. I sent them for a few weeks. I didn't really hear from anyone. I liked writing them, so I kept sending them. and I did start to hear from some people, and they said, I really enjoyed this, or I went and did this, or interestingly, like I sent this to my wife's company, or I sent this to my brother and his family, and they loved it. And it became clear to me that they were kind of going outside the company. And I was discussing at one point with a group of other CEOs about how I had kind of started this little Friday note and thought it was a great way to stay in touch with people. They said, "Oh, well, send it to us and we'll take a look." And I sent it to a bunch of them after the meeting. And one person has done his own to this day, and the other said, "This is great. We'll just send this to our team every Friday." And so this was sort of the second thing where I said, "Oh, maybe people outside the organization would like this." And I was sort of having a hard time managing it just via my BCC. So I just signed up for a very basic newsletter service. People were asking me for some of the old ones. I probably had 20 of them at the time. So I put them on a WordPress template site because the old ones were all in my sent mail. Like you couldn't find them. And I just called it Friday Forward because it was getting forwarded. And I dropped all those people on the list, a couple hundred, and I expected a lot of hate mail and take me off. But I got the same positive responses and that they were sharing it. And someone wrote an article a couple months later, weeks later, that said, "This is the only newsletter I read." A couple thousand people signed up, and it just started to kind of take off from there. And 5 years later, it's almost 200,000 people in 60 countries, which I still have to kind of blink a little bit each week when I see those opens on the Friday morning.
So when you started sending it in the company, What were you thinking? as in, how were you thinking about how it might land, or actually, you thought, what, I want to share this. What were you hoping that it would do to your employees?
I was hoping it could be like almost not, a discussion not about work or to our organizational focus on just building capacity holistically. Like this was just something that people could look at to think about how they could do something a little better, get better, and maybe it would encourage someone to take a step forward. And it was also just a good way to connect and stay in touch, with a distributed team at the time.
Mm-hmm. And looking back, because I doubt it'll be intentional, looking back, is there anything that you think that was saying about what was, about anything you might be role modeling? So, for example, I'll tell you what I'm thinking, actually. I'm thinking this is really role modeling a learning culture, a sharing culture, and like you say, caring about the person. Do you think that, looking back, do you think that any of that helped build what you wanted to build?
Yeah, I mean, so one of our core values, we have three core values: own it, embrace relationships, and excel and improve. So I think, I think this manifested several of those, including excel and improve. We're a learning culture. We're about getting better. And so, yeah, the topics were about pushing your boundaries, but it wasn't like, and this is where this, again, our belief in this capacity building of people is holistic, because it wasn't like, oh, let's learn how to run the assembly line faster, right? The topics were about how do you get better as a person or a human being, or get, do better with your energy level or setting goals that then may have a ripple effect for you, both personally and professionally.
Have you seen that there's any topics or any kind of stories that seem to resonate more with people? Have you got a sense of that, or actually it just varies because the list is so big now?
It does. It's interesting. It varies. I mean, I can tell if you get anything, which I don't write about anything political, but if anyone gets near politics, what's interesting is, through COVID and some of this, I have tried to talk about leadership, and leadership has been very much in failure of leadership at local and government levels. But as soon as you talk about anyone in the realm of leadership, it brings in so much politics. And
Yeah.
I actually thought people could separate the two, but I don't really think they can. So each week I have someone who writes me and says, this is the best one you ever sent. And it has nothing to do with what I wrote. It has to do with where they were that week, and it hit at the perfect time for them. But sometimes I know which ones are going to strike a chord and get a lot of feedback. Sometimes I don't. There was actually one a few weeks ago that I struggled to write mightily because I didn't want to sound like I was being a jerk, because it started with a story of a woman who kept writing me and telling me to change how I wrote my newsletter.
Right.
and it sort of was about this topic of the feedback of one, and there's just some feedback you should ignore. That you understand exactly what they're saying, and it's not your value proposition, and if they need to change, you don't need to change. And that one got an overwhelming number of responses, that which I wouldn't have guessed. So
Yeah, I remember that one. Now that you're saying that, yeah.
I was nicer in the email than I would be describing it. The situation. It's like you can unsubscribe.
Yes.
Stop rewriting my notes and sending them back to me.
Yes. That's the magic of those newsletters. You can unsubscribe. It's all right.
Yeah.
So there's a chapter that I particularly liked, or one of the posts in Friday Forward in the book. Actually, it's the chapter on work-life balance.
Yes.
And I love the quote you've used by Alan de Botton: "There is no such thing as work-life balance. Everything worth fighting for unbalances your life." Tell us more about that quote and why it opens that chapter.
Yeah, look, this week is a great example of that. So I spent the long weekend mountain biking with my family and kids and being outside all day and having a great time. And then we have our big global event this week, our summit, which is all online for the first time. And in the midst of that, I've got a book deadline and some other deals we're working on. And it's been 14 hours a day and absolutely crazy, right? So my kids are around, but I really haven't seen them in the last 3 days. So, then it'll be a weekend again soon. So if I was worried about balance, I'd be trying to like check off each of those boxes every day, and I'd be frustrated if it wasn't, in balance in a micro sense, versus I'm doing important things that I'll integrate, in my life, and understanding that the last 3 days are those days when I needed to be 90% work. And, last weekend I was able to be 90% family and self, and that's what I needed then. And I build a life where those things are interchangeable, because either of those things on a full-time basis would then probably have a consequence for one of the other ones. So it's not. I think it's more than semantics and saying I don't believe in work-life balance. Because again, I think when you're sitting there trying to make everything balanced, you will feel like a failure versus finding a bunch of key puzzle pieces that all fit together.
It gives it a kind of fluidity also, I think, whereas balance always seems quite rigid and even static, whereas what you're describing is a lot more fluid. And I suppose there's a lot of listening to yourself and where you are at each moment. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, look, if you're about to close a huge, $1 million contract for your business, like everyone's working on that 14 hours a day, and you're excited and you're pumped and the adrenaline's, going. That's not a day when you say, "Oh, you know what? I'm going to beat myself up because I didn't get my workout in." So Randy Zuckerberg, who's Mark's sister, who's probably a centimillionaire, if not a billionaire too, spoke at a conference I was at, and she listed like 6 things, and she said, work, family, health, food, something. I can't remember the 3. And she's like, and this is someone who has all the financial means in the world. I've learned that you can do 3 in a day. And, so in a week, you might want to like spread it across the portfolio. But if you try to think you'll do 6 in a day, you won't get any of these things done. And it was just that sort of permission to understand that it's not always in a perfect balance.
Yeah, excellent. And you were talking about, we just using an example of the company and a lot of everyone pumped up, etc. What gives you the sense that there's energy in your company being virtual? So we can imagine, like, we can sense when there's stuff happening and there's a certain energy in the company when we're all in the same space. But what things do you sense, feel, hear from your virtual company that give you that sense of, okay, there's a different kind of energy at the moment?
Yeah, well, we actually use a bunch of tools that even ask, one called Tiny Pulse. It just asks people every week a question or how they're doing or comment. So there's a lot of communication that goes on, in video. I think you can see and where people are and get a sense for that. But those the pulsing tools are helpful, right? If all of a sudden you see overwhelmed comments, like you start to get a sense and look for trends. And we actually get that data like longitudinally, so we can start to see, are there specific things? Is it end of month? Oh, maybe is it that people are overwhelmed with end of month reports? So we try to collect a lot of data, both formally and anecdotally, to sort of build a picture of where people are collectively and individually.
And how regularly do you take the pulse?
It goes out every Wednesday. And then once a month, it asks people on a scale of 1 to 10. 10 is, I pack my resume, and it's all anonymous, pack my resume and I'm out the door. And 1 is, and 10 is, I'm jumping for joy. Like, how happy are you, or how engaged are you? So we have that data point once a month across the teams, which is helpful too.
And what do you do with, sorry, this is going to be my last question around that, but what do you do with the data? Do you see if there's a trend? Do you see what's happening at that moment? Do you then talk to people? What do you do when you get that data?
Yeah, you can actually have anonymous conversations with people, and they can choose to identify themselves or not. We look for trends or things that are actionable. Like, does it match what we're hearing? Mm-hmm. Right? Are we hearing that everyone's good and there's bad numbers, or are we hearing that, or is the opposite true? So I think it gives us a data point. Like, we know people are fatigued right now, and some of our engagement numbers are relatively the lowest they've ever been. So, but when we check in with people, they're like, yeah, it's hard right now. Like, it's not anything the company's doing. I'm just exhausted. I've got, 2 kids homeschooling. And so it just helps map up the picture. Like what we're seeing in the numbers reflects what we're hearing in the conversations. And that's what you want. You want no surprises.
Yeah, that's what it will bring up, the surprises. Or that, it reminds me also of that feedback of one also conversation, how you look at what's coming back. The surprises.
Yeah, you got to be careful in these things too of not look. My stance on feedback is there's one of three replies to feedback. There is this is great and we're going to make the change. This is more complicated and we're going to look into it, and we're not going to do this for these three reasons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, excellent. I really like that. So I've got one question to wrap up, and we'll see if it's a question that this is what comes up. I was thinking, are you at the moment looking for any stories or examples or anecdotes to illustrate a particular topic that's on your mind, or actually are you still going, okay, I'm being open to what the week throws me or whatever I want to look at next?
It goes both ways. I actually have a pretty long list. I was looking at it because I have tons of ideas, and I looked at it, and some of them I haven't remembered writing about. So sometimes I write down a theme or a note or something, and then something happens in the real world that triggers it, because the formula seems to be sort of real world experience plus framework. So sometimes there is a whole story or something happens. I'm kind of mapping out two or three in my head. Other times, like this week, I went back to, it was a rare week where I was like, I mapped out the last 4 weeks, and I went back to some notes I had made a couple months ago about some topics I wanted to dive into. So it goes a little bit both ways.
Thank you very much. So I think the call to action is going to be anyone who wants to connect with you and, well, either grab the Friday Forward book, or even better, sign up to the Friday Forward newsletter. Where should we point them to?
Everything is at robertglazer.com, so glazer.com. Or you can even Google Friday Forward. It's probably easier than trying to type it in. And you can find the podcast, the book, and everything else right on there.
Excellent. And anything else you want to say to listeners, to those either who have just made the sudden forced jump to remote, or those who are already working in virtual organizations?
I don't know that there's a one-liner, but I think after this is over, you're going to want to make sure that you pick an organization that whose philosophy supports what your philosophy is. And either of those may have changed during the pandemic. So I think it's important to make sure you have kind of ongoing alignment from how and where do you want to work.
Excellent. Well, Robert Glaser, thank you very much.
Thank you, Pilar.
Well, listeners, I hope you took some inspiration from Robert Glaser, and I do invite you to share with myself and other listeners how you stay inspired, whether you're in charge of a team or not. And of course, any questions or reflections that you might have around organizational culture or team identity in the online space. It would be lovely to hear from you, lovely to hear your thoughts on it, what you're doing to be intentional about creating the culture that you want to see. I think that point was really important, that we're not saying you have to have a culture that looks like this. All you need to do is make sure you're being intentional and have the culture that you want to see, or the one that you want to nurture. And I think it's fit to say also that if you are in an organization and are worried about your employees losing their sense of belonging because they are working physically apart, then we are designing a new service to help you create an in-house podcast. We can even host it if you want, because I love podcasting. So I would love to come and create the show with you, where the protagonists are going to be your people, their stories, their lessons learned, their achievements. And so using podcasting really as a community building tool, and also a way of amplifying your culture away from the screen. We are beginning to see that many people are starting to lose that initial interest in having random conversations online, whether they are social or whether they're about things that matter to them, about things that are happening in the organization, not directly related to their work. And we think that a podcast is a very good tool to continue that conversation in an asynchronous way, but also away from the screen. It's very portable. So I'd be very happy to talk to you about how this might work if you're remotely interested. You don't need to have my jokes in your podcast. But I really would love to explore this if it's of interest to you. There's lots of ways in which we could do this. So you can get in touch through virtualnotdistant.com. Feel free to email me if that's your thing, Pilar, Pilar, at virtualnotdistant.com. And if you just want to stay in touch, well, that's lovely too. Remember that we have a monthly newsletter that you can sign up through virtualnotdistant.com. And we actually have a complimentary Leading Through Visible Teamwork PDF at the moment when you first sign up. We also have a page on LinkedIn if you're there. And you can follow us on Twitter at Virtual Teamwork with with a 0 instead of an O for work. We are everywhere. So listeners, maybe I'll see you one of those spaces, or maybe next time you tune in to our show. Thank you for listening. A big thank you for listening to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast produced by Virtual Not Distant. If you have something to add to the conversation, let us know through the contact form over at virtualnotdistant.com. I have been your host, Pilar Orti, and I'm signing off now. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, enjoy.